We're moving on now to Britain, where the British Prime Minister David Cameron tried to describe his own Christian faith at Easter, but it backfired. And many accused him of fostering alienation and division by characterizing the UK as a Christian country. The church and state issue has now sparked a furious debate in Britain and is instigating answers to other fundamental questions, such as whether Scotland wants to remain within the UK and whether Britain wants to remain within the European Union. We're now joined by i24 news correspondent in London, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. Obviously, by saying that England is a Christian country, it's not, I would say not a surprise that it sparks such a furious debate, but it is a surprise that it sparks this much of a debate in terms of, headlines and so forth.
Well, during Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister, his spokesman declared that the government didn't do God. And unlike in America, it's long been considered something of an impediment for British political party leaders to admit to any religious beliefs. And Mr. Blair was indeed mocked by some for his faith. So it has come of something of a surprise that in the last few weeks, religion's been playing a growing part of the British political discourse. During a recent trip to Israel, Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, made comments about his Jewish identity, declaring his desire to be Britain's first Jewish Prime Minister, though some count Benjamin Disraeli as having already achieved that despite his conversion to Christianity. But meanwhile, David Cameron, as you say, the current British Prime Minister, has made several statements about his own Christian faith during the last few weeks and has now declared Britain to be a Christian country, urging the UK to be prouder of its Christian foundations.
What would you say was a slip of the tongue? Because if you just look across the Atlantic and the American leaders there, every U.S. president, every U.S. political leader actually has to be some kind of man or woman of faith, and they do use that in their rhetoric and in their speeches and use it to convey and sway voters.
Well, it definitely wasn't a slip of the tongue, because if it was a repeated one in several situations, culminating in an article in a church publication. So Mr. Cameron's made a very definite effort here to set himself apart from the other party leaders who all say that they are atheists. Even Ed Miliband, with his increasing emphasis on his Jewish heritage, emphasizes that he is an atheist. However, some say that this is probably his attempt to appeal to voters who are being attracted towards the UK Independence Party, UKIP, rather than the Conservative Party, many of whom are more likely to be more religious, according to polls.
But also, according to polls, there's a decline in the number of believers, if you will. The number of atheists are growing, and it will overtake Christians in 2030, according to some research.
Well, the best research, I guess, in terms of how thorough the technique of collecting the evidence is the census. Now, that does show a drop in identification with the church. However, what needs to be set apart is the distinction between people who are actually observant in a religion and people who identify with a religion. Mr. Cameron himself has said that he is not the most observant of Christians, but he does have his own particular brand of faith, and he does find that it is reassuring to him in times of trouble. So I think he's trying to emphasize the Christian bedrock of the UK's values and ethics. And I think that many religious leaders from across the board have actually welcomed that renewed emphasis on ethics and the Judeo-Christian values upon which the United Kingdom's ethics have been built over the years. I don't think he's trying at in any way to make other religions feel less welcome or less able to practice their religion here. So the distinction between people who identify as Christian and people who practice as Christian, maybe attending church services every Sunday, is one that's important in absorbing this new trend of politicians trying to identify with a religion, albeit in a somewhat diet sense.
So even if it was intentional, as you say, and he's merely trying to describe his own identity, it still backfired in terms of many celebrities, politicians, news presenters, comedians, Nobel Prize scientists, all are signatories on a letter demanding that Cameron rescind the statement.
Well, you're referring, of course, to a letter that was published in the Daily Telegraph with 50 famous celebrity atheists saying that they did find that these statements were divisive. Yeah. But Mr. Cameron has been clear that he is welcoming to all religions. So I think there's an even spread of opinions on this one. People who welcome his statements and people who find that it might be divisive and they feel it might be threatening. Of course, what most commentators are saying is that with an election on the horizon, it's no surprise that politicians from across the board are making statements that they feel will appeal to different parts of the electorate. And in that regard, people perhaps are somewhat skeptical about Mr. Cameron's newly found or newly stated Christian faith, saying that maybe it's aimed squarely at UKIP supporters who, according to a YouGov poll, are more likely to identify with a religion themselves than the voters for other parties. And of course, UKIP is that threat to the Conservative Party, taking away some of its more right-wing potential voters, and of course having a stronger position on Euroscepticism than the Conservative Party does now. So it's seen in a sense as perhaps an effort to win back the voters who were offended by Mr. Cameron's support for marriage equality for homosexuals and his support and his lack of Eurosceptic credentials in the eyes of UKIP supporters. Those people maybe are traditionally more religious and might react well to this sort of statement from David Cameron.
Jonathan Sacerdoti there in London, our i24 News correspondent there. Thank you for joining us this morning. And coming up, we're going to speak about the